we're talking about hope today, and actually this feels really timely. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of stuff going on at the world at the moment that can leave us feeling really hopeless. John's already mentioned Ukraine. I actually started this morning reading the news, and I was reading an article with forensic teams. I'm terrible at pronunciation. I'm going to call it buka, but I think that's not how you say it. We'll go with that anyway. About how they are having to sift through mass graves and finding all the horror from last weekend's massacre of these families that are stood there waiting to see if their loved ones are in them. The article even mentioned this guy who'd been stood there all day crying and watching, and his family weren't there. He wasn't worried about that. He was there feeling guilty that he hadn't done anything to stop it when he couldn't possibly have. For those of us who are watching from the outside as these heartbreaking events unfold, we can be left feeling really hopeless because we don't know how to help. We can feel quite useless because we're not there. Like, what can we possibly do to help? Ukrainians who've been unable to flee can be left feeling really hopeless because they don't know if they're going to get out. People don't know if they're going to escape, if they're going to survive this war. Those who have been able to evacuate might be feeling hopeless because they don't know if they're ever going to be able to go home or where they're going to live in the meantime, and if their family and friends who are still stuck, who haven't gotten out, are going to be safe. There's also another group who I think might be feeling hopeless because of Ukraine, and that's Russians who are opposed to the war. I watched this video quite soon after the invasion started where these Ukrainian and Russian women living in London met on camera for the first time. The first pair just held each other and cried. And throughout this video, they all talked about how heartbroken they were. But the Russian women made it really clear that obviously they understood that the Ukrainian women were struggling more than them. But partway through this video, there's this bit where this Russian woman spoke really candidly about how since the beginning of the invasion, she'd been feeling suicidal. Seeing the horrible thing that her country was doing had left her feeling so hopeless that on multiple occasions she'd considered taking her own life. A little bit closer to home here in the UK, we're facing the worst cost of living crisis in 60 years, with so many families slipping into fuel poverty, with people having to choose between heating and feeding their children, which just, we knew it was possibly coming, but is a heartbreaking thing to see in this country. On a kind of grander scale, I don't know if anyone saw, but last Monday, the IPCC released this report showing that our window for fighting climate change is rapidly closing. It set out the steps that we need to take to limit global warming so it doesn't exceed the 1.5 limit that we've set. And the thing that I find really sad about the report is that all these things that they've set out that we need to do are solutions that we already have. We've known about this for a while, but we're not doing them despite having this knowledge. There's a lot going on in the world right now that can leave us feeling hopeless. The verse we're looking at today is about hope and justice. If you've got a Bible, we're going to turn to Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, hopefully. Yeah, it's going to be on the screen behind me. Where's my bookmark? That's helpful. So this is the parable of the sheep and the goats. And it starts like this. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as the shepherd separates sheep from goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came and visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared by for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was ill and in prison, and you did not look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did I see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or ill or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. I have to admit, when I was given this verse and asked to talk about hope, I was a bit like, how do you talk about hope from this? I spent some time with John. I worked it out, but it's a slightly scary passage. I think we could admit that. It's not the most hope-filled passage when we first look at it, but I'm going to argue today that obviously it is. This passage is both a promise of final justice and a call to pursue justice in our lives. In this chapter, there are parables that come before this. Jesus is speaking to the Jewish people who are living under occupation. They're experiencing heavy taxation and they're being ruled over Roman governors like Pontius Pilate. They don't have control over their country. The Israelites at this time are holding on to the hope that God's promised Messiah is going to come and save them from this injustice. Many of them thought that he would come and expel the Romans and punish them for the suffering they'd inflicted on God's people. But what Jesus throws throughout the parables, I talked about this last time I was up here, it clearly is my theme at the moment. He talks throughout all the parables about how the kingdom of God looks so different from what the Jews imagined. I think sometimes, like the Jews, our view of justice doesn't align with God's. So we're going to have a little look at what God's justice does look like. We follow a God who passionately longs for justice. It's a theme we see in this verse and throughout the Bible. In the first chapter of Genesis, the foundation of biblical justice is laid with the simple, powerful declaration that every human is made in the image of God. This establishes right from the very beginning of the Bible that every human is equal before God and therefore deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I think Genesis also gives us an indication of the root of injustice. In the story of Adam and Eve, humans turn their back on God's definition of good and evil. And throughout the rest of the Bible and all of human history, we see the continuation of that as people redefine what good and evil means for their own benefit at the expense of others, which really often leads to the most vulnerable being exploited. While being made at the image of God clearly makes us deserving of justice, it does something else. It imbues us with God's longing for justice. One commentary that focuses on our verse says this, which I think is wonderful. Justice is one of the most profound longings of the human race. If there is no justice, then deep within ourselves we know that something is out of joint. Justice is hard to define and harder still to put into practice, but that has never stopped human beings and societies seeking it, praying for it, and working to find ways of doing it better. And justice does not simply mean punishing wickedness, though that's regularly involved. It means bringing the world back into balance. This call to pursue justice is established in Genesis. In Genesis 18, chapter 19, God speaks about why he chose Abraham, and he says this: I have singled him out so that he will direct his sons and their descendants to keep the way of the Lord, doing what is just and right. Then I will do for Abraham all that I have promised. The call to pursue justice is there right at the beginning when the descendants of Abraham are become God's chosen people, when they're identified as that. And our adoption into the family of God makes that our calling too. Let's have a quick look, though, at that verse I've just mentioned about Abraham, because it talks about justice and righteousness. What does that actually look like? I got to get quite excited about Hebrew words at this. Excuse me for that. The first word we're going to talk very quickly about is tzedakah. That's the word here that's translated as righteousness, which isn't really a word we use nowadays. It's kind of a churchy, jargony word. So let's, think about what that means for a minute. In this context, it's talking about right relationship between people. It's an ethical standard characterized by treating people as the image of God, what they truly are. The second word that comes just after that is the word mishpat. It's translated here as just, and it can also mean justice. There's a really brilliant Bible Project video about justice. I was going to encourage people to go and watch it, but then you've heard some of my talk. Kind of covers that. But they talk about the fact that tzedakah is, mishpat, sorry. Mishpat is the actions that we take to bring about tzedakah, to bring about those right relationships and that justice. Mishpat, the justice that Mishpat describes in the 421 times that it appears in the Old Testament is more commonly restorative justice as opposed to retribution. To pursue mishpat is to seek out the vulnerable, to advocate for them, and to work to change social structures that create and perpetuate injustice. The call to pursue tzedakah and mishpat is the call to live a radically selfless way of life. The Bible Project describes this as courageously making other people's problems our problems. It's a call to reject the me-first attitude that pervades our culture, the selfishness that comes so easily to us as humans. It's a call to the actions described in the parable of the sheep and goats, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to welcome the stranger, and to care for the sick and imprisoned. The pursuit of tzedakah and mishpat is a lifetime commitment, and it requires us to re-examine our whole lives. In the interactions we have with others, do we actually treat them as those made in the image of God? Do we give our money to companies that use sweatshops, that don't pay livable wages, or massively contribute to the changing climate of our world? Do we support and vote for political parties that help the vulnerable, or those that perpetuate the injustice they're facing? When we're walking down the street, do we ignore the homeless person sitting there, or do we stop and talk to them? Maybe buy them some food? Do we welcome the stranger? These are the things that we have to reconsider when we recognize this call on all of our lives. You may remember I said that this is a parable about justice and hope. And you might be wondering where the hope fits into all of this. I think they're inextricably linked. I don't think it's possible to face injustice without hope. We can't get up every day and face the injustice in our own lives and we see around the world, things like Ukraine, without hope. If we lose hope, then reading the news and even living our daily lives is exhausting, and we end up in despair. Growing up, I really, really struggled to feel hopeful. My upbringing was quite deprived. I was really bullied during primary school, and I had epilepsy, which just all of it together made life really tough. And I was naturally really quite pessimistic. But my mum taught me about hope. She taught me about the hope that we can have in Jesus despite our circumstances. And it made all the difference. My life didn't change overnight, and sometimes it's still hard, but I changed. And as I got older and I went to secondary school, I found my voice, not just to speak up for myself, but to speak up for other people. And that's the second reason we need hope. We can't work to bring justice if we lack hope. It's just impossible. We have to have hope, not only that one day God will bring ultimate justice to the whole world and it will all be brought perfectly back into balance, but that he can work through us now to bring justice. We must have hope that actually when we're going out, potentially into quite dark places, that Jesus already reigns there. This week I completely, by accident, stumbled across this brilliant quote from Pope John Paul II. And he said this: "Even if the forces of darkness appear to prevail, those who believe in God know that evil and death does not have the final say." And that's a really hard thing to remember. And it's the hope that we need if we're going to pursue justice. And it's hope that only ever comes from Jesus. Amen.